On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines of the 1st Division landed on an obscure Pacific island called Guadalcanal. It marked the first American offensive of World War II. The campaign to secure the island lasted 6 months, and for much of its course, the balance teetered precariously from one side to the other. It included 6 major naval battles, daily aerial engagements, and countless clashes on land. No campaign in either theater saw such sustained action by sea, land, and air. For both the United States and Japan, their clash on what became known as the Island of Death was the result of an event which had occurred exactly 8 months earlier.
I heard all this explosion like everybody else, and I thought, my goodness, can't they leave us alone on Sunday morning? We thought the Navy was practicing.
My reaction was, with a few cuss words, was drill in Pearl Harbor on Sunday? I don't believe it. I soon realized when the ship started to shake that it wasn't drill.
They told me to get up on my gun, which was right next deck above me, and I was a gun captain on a 5-inch 25 anti-aircraft battery. And we had 50 rounds of ammunition up, and we started firing like everybody else. We fired, everything was flying. We got credit for 4, but who knows, the whole world was shooting.
We took a bomb hit in our turret. It hit the center gun near the chase, which is where the barrel of the gun goes into the turret itself. It was only a few inches off center. And what a lot of people might not realize, if that had been over probably 12 inches, it would have gone right down between the 2 barrels of the left gun and the center gun. We'd have been Arizona number 2, because the black powder magazines were down in that area, and we wouldn't have made it. So fate was on our side.
One of the Zeros come down, and he took a little aim at me, come right there. I was having my back to the sun, and as he machine gunned me, he missed me about 8 foot. And he gave me a big grin, a big smile as I've ever seen. And he had one of his teeth was gold. One of his 2 front teeth was gold. But over the years, I forgot which one.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The devastating surprise attack by Japanese forces on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor vaulted the United States into World War II. Never in modern history had a war begun with so smashing a victory. In 1 hour and 50 minutes, the Japanese had sunk or shattered 21 American ships. More than 2,400 Americans were dead and nearly 1,200 more wounded. The Japanese lost 29 planes and 55 pilots. 5 midget submarines which tried to penetrate Pearl Harbor were beached or sunk. It was one of the cheapest military triumphs on record. In Tokyo, the government lost no time in exploiting the news of Pearl Harbor, Japan's greatest victory. The militarists had demonstrated the power of the Japanese Empire. They had done the impossible, sunk the United States Navy. But although the attack was a resounding success, it was not the victory the Japanese had hoped for.
The big break that the United States Pacific Fleet had was that all 3 of its carriers were out of port that day. And the Nagumo strike planners had specifically targeted those carriers, hoping to destroy them in port. So that was a huge stroke of luck, which paid enormous dividends within the next 6 months.
The Japanese strike at Pearl Harbor was only the first in a series of coordinated strikes and invasions, as the forces of Imperial Japan surged south and east in a deluge of destruction. During the first week of the war, the Japanese moved with startling speed. Guam was attacked and quickly engulfed, as was the tiny American outpost at Wake Island. On the Chinese mainland, Japanese troops advanced onto British leased territory across from Hong Kong Island. The Philippine island of Luzon and the northern coast of Malaya were also invaded. In Malaya, a sizable Japanese force was ashore in only a matter of days, ready to launch an offensive down the Malayan Peninsula toward British-held Singapore. Key to Malaya, key to the wealth of the Indies, Singapore looked seaward for trouble. But behind the British, the Japanese began their assaults. Advancing through a jungle that was thought to be impenetrable, the enemy closed in on Singapore. Additional Japanese troops moved into Malaya from Thailand and French Indochina, both of which had been occupied earlier. Although the campaign down the narrowing peninsula should have been a difficult one for the invaders, resistance was quickly routed. The Malayan campaign was one of the most successfully fought actions in the series of Japanese assaults in December of '41. Within 3 weeks, Japanese forces had seized all of Malaya south to a front less than 100 miles above Singapore. In early February 1942, Singapore fell to the Japanese. Paralleling the campaign in Malaya was the assault on Hong Kong. For a century, the symbol of British prestige in the Orient, a lack of manpower and a poorly organized defense doomed the historic city. With British territory on the mainland completely won, attention was focused on Hong Kong Island. After a siege of 16 days, the British were forced to surrender. While the Japanese advanced unchecked early in 1942, the Americans attempted to retaliate with a series of carrier raids throughout the Pacific.
Following Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Pacific Fleet only had one way, effectively, to strike back. It did not become immediately obvious, but the torpedo scandal of 1942 essentially robbed the American submarine community of a viable weapon. And as that became more obvious, it necessarily lessened the options open to Admiral Nimitz, who replaced Admiral Kimmel as sink-pack fleet. The only option remaining, really, was a series of hit-and-run carrier raids, primarily throughout the Central and South Pacific, beginning in the Gilberts and Marshalls, starting in February of 1942. The Leh Salamaua raid, which preceded the Battle of the Coral Sea, And then, of course, the Doolittle raid against Japan proper that was launched from the Hornet in April of 1942.
On April 18, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25s from the carrier Hornet in a raid on Japan. Doolittle's bombers successfully attacked Tokyo and 3 other target cities on the Japanese home islands. And though the raid was of little tactical consequence, it provided a boost to flagging American morale.
What we did gain from those early operations was essentially operational research. We proved that the composition of our pre-war carrier air groups was valid. We proved that the training and techniques were effective, especially dive bombing. And we also learned that the Japanese were not invincible.
The Doolittle raid indicated to the Japanese war staff that the threat of retaliation from the east was more urgent than originally thought, and plans to invade Australia were curtailed. Instead, the campaign to capture Port Moresby on the southern tip of New Guinea was intensified. From Port Moresby, Japanese aircraft could cut off supply lines to northern Australia. As a sidelight, the staff ordered the extension of Japanese control on the Solomon Islands to the southern portion of the archipelago to an island called Tulagi and its neighbor, Guadalcanal. In the Philippines, the Japanese consolidated their early gains and set about seizing control of all the islands. Allied forces were eventually pushed back onto the fortified peninsula of Bataan. General Douglas MacArthur was ordered out by the president and left the defenders with his famous "I shall return" quote and precious little else. Resistance on Bataan ended in early April, a surrender, a prelude to the infamous Bataan Death March. Only the forces on the island fortress of Corregidor remained in the path of Japanese conquest, and with the fall of Bataan, the full weight of Japanese strength was focused on the tiny island. It was only a matter of time for the besieged defenders, and on May 6, 1942, General Wainwright surrendered all U.S. armed forces in the Philippines. With the defeat in the Philippines and at Singapore, the tide of catastrophe and humiliation for Great Britain and the United States reached its zenith. In 5 months, the enemy had moved at will across the vast spaces of the Pacific, devouring prize after prize.
The Japanese plan was to establish a very strong defensive perimeter around the areas that they captured. They would then allow the Americans to beat themselves against this defensive perimeter, and as the losses mounted, America would lose the will to fight. They would then offer to negotiate an end to the war, and those negotiations, it was felt, would lead to a greatly enhanced position of the Japanese in Asia. Their miscalculation was they misunderstood America's will to fight once we were aroused and in the war, and that miscalculation would cost the Japanese dearly.
The day after Corregidor's fall came the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the first American attack ever launched upon an enemy carrier. Planes from Enterprise and Yorktown pounced on a Japanese invasion force out to engulf Port Moresby.
This was the first time in history that aircraft carriers had actually fought each other. On the first day, May 7th, the 2 American air groups from the Yorktown and Lexington sank the light Japanese carrier Shoho. On the next day, May 8th, American forces inflicted damage on the 2 larger Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, but sustained damage to Yorktown and lost Lexington. But if ever there had been any doubt, especially on the American side, that the war in the Pacific was going to hinge upon aircraft carriers, Coral Sea would have removed any doubt about that, because those were the only types of ships that were directly engaged. And for the first time in naval history, the opposing fleets never even sighted one another. So Coral Sea is where carrier combat really began.
The Battle of the Coral Sea was a tactical victory for the Imperial fleet, but by knocking two large Japanese carriers out of action, the strategic victory was American. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the Japanese combined fleet, was certain Japan must win the war within the first year or lose it later, and that ultimate victory would be Japan's only if the American Navy could be neutralized. The first round had gone decidedly to the Japanese, and now the time for the decisive blow had come. The Japanese believed the American fleet could be drawn out to defend Midway Island, and it was there that the knockout was to be delivered. The plan called for a diversionary attack on the Aleutians and the invasion of Midway. The successful occupation of Midway would force the Americans into battle. A vast armada of 162 ships was assembled at ports in and around Japan and sailed for Midway on May 27, 1942.
Immediately after Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto said that granted the situation that he found, he expected to run wild for 6 months, but beyond that time, he could guarantee very little. And in that context, he made his famous statement that he feared all that Japan had done was to awaken a sleeping giant. Midway, therefore, was pretty much a roll of the geopolitical dice. It was an all-or-nothing gamble on the part of Imperial Japan, but if the United States Pacific Fleet and its Army counterparts were forced to withdraw from Hawaii with a Japanese buildup only 1,100 miles from Pearl Harbor, that would allow Japan the critical breathing space she needed to digest the enormous ocean and land areas along the Pacific Rim that they had accumulated in the previous 6 months.
American strategy assumed that Japan had chosen Midway as a target. This was confirmed by American cryptologists who had broken the Japanese secret code.
Admiral Nimitz's problem was considerably simplified in that Commander Rochefort's code breakers were able to tell him not only when and where the Japanese were going to strike next, specifically at Midway at dawn on June 4th, but there was going to be a diversionary raid in the Aleutians, which Nimitz therefore knew he could largely ignore. And it also gave the composition of the Japanese strike force. We knew 4 carriers were involved. We also knew most of the supporting units. So Midway really was a victory of intelligence.
Armed with firm knowledge of Japanese strategy, Admiral Chester Nimitz made 2 crucial decisions. He ordered round-the-clock repairs on Yorktown, damaged at the Coral Sea, so that she would be ready for the coming fight. Second, he would position his carrier groups 300 miles north of Midway, where Japanese reconnaissance was unlikely to search. With the decision made, Nimitz gathered his available ships together in the Central Pacific and strengthened Midway's air fleet. Massive forces were converging on Midway, a pinpoint in the ocean. For America, Midway was the last sentry between Japan and Hawaii. The Pacific War was focused on a tiny coral atoll 6 miles in diameter. May 31st, the American task force rendezvoused northeast of Midway. The officers and men were told a Japanese attack for the purpose of capturing Midway is expected. The successful conclusion of the operation now commencing will be of great value to our country. June 3rd, a solitary Catalina bomber from Midway spots the Japanese invasion transports. The report was radioed in and a flight of B-17s ordered out. First encounters caused little damage among the Japanese fleet. Just before dawn on June 4th, the Japanese launched their attack against Midway. 108 planes left in rapid succession from the flight decks of Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, and Akagi, while 93 more armed with armor-piercing ordnance remained behind in case American surface units were located. Although forewarned of the raid, the Marine pilots and their obsolete aircraft were no match for the Japanese. 24 American planes were shot down or badly damaged. The attack wrecked most of the base facilities, but caused only minor damage to the airstrips. Japanese reconnaissance flights had failed to turn up American surface units, and with a report indicating Midway needed a second pounding, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo ordered fragmentation bombs substituted for armor piercing. At this very moment, the first American carrier planes were sent against the Japanese. Radio reports placed the enemy just within the range of Enterprise and Hornet. The decision was made to launch. Aboard the Japanese carriers, the rearming process was almost complete when reconnaissance flights spotted American ships to the northeast. The news stunned Nagumo, who halted the changeover until the composition of the force could be confirmed. During this interlude, American bombers from Midway were dealt with by the Combat Air Patrol as the fleet maneuvered to avoid the Americans. The Japanese came through the attack unscathed, as not a single hit was scored. Minutes later, the presence of an enemy carrier was confirmed. Shortly after the second wave of Japanese strike aircraft returned from Midway, Nagumo shrewdly changed course to open the range while rearming and refueling took place. It was only by luck that the first American planes arrived over the crowded decks of the Japanese carriers. The first to find them was Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, which had become separated from its covering force en route. Without waiting for support, Torpedo 8 attacked, but their courage and determination availed them nothing. Of the squadron's 15 planes, all were destroyed and not one hit was scored. Torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown suffered a similar fate. Of 41 torpedo planes from 3 carriers, only 6 survived.
It's at this juncture in the battle that the Japanese fleet has driven off the American torpedo bombers. However, they're scattered from their defensive maneuvers. Their combat air patrol Zeros are down at lower altitudes because they haven't been able to regain any kind of height at this point. And so as they attempt to reorganize, they continue with this refueling and rearmament operation, which means they have ordnance on their decks, they have fuel lines strung out, they're very vulnerable. And it's at precisely this moment that the American dive bombers arrive to deliver their attack.
37 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise approached the target unopposed, as the Japanese fighters had not been able to regain altitude after countering the earlier torpedo attack. At 10:25, the SBDs pushed over into their dives. Enemy defenses, off balance from the earlier assault, were unequal to the new attack. In 5 amazing minutes, the course of battle and the war was reversed. One of the first bombs hit Akagi and ignited fuel lines on her flight deck. A second bomb caused ammunition aboard to explode, and Akagi was sinking. Kaga suffered similar treatment as bombs knocked out the bridge and penetrated her hangars. Yorktown's dive bombers concentrated on the third Japanese carrier, Soryu, scoring 3 hits. While the crew battled the resulting fires, the American submarine Nautilus jumped into the fight. 3 torpedoes from below, added to the bombs from above, sealed Soryu's fate. Aboard the last remaining carrier, Hiryu, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi immediately ordered a strike against the American flat tops.
The Japanese were quick off the mark and launched a dive bombing attack, which arrived overhead Yorktown approximately noon, a shootout at high noon in the traditions of the Old West. They got roughly handled by the Yorktown Combat Air Patrol with some help from Spruance's 2 Wildcat squadrons. But the long and the short of it was that about 7 valves got through the CAP, and of those, 3 got hits on the Yorktown, which did serious damage. The bombs caused fires, but the main damage was that they seriously damaged the propulsion, and Yorktown gradually went dead in the water. Now, in the meantime, the Yorktown scout bombers had come back from the first mission, and they landed aboard Enterprise and were immediately absorbed into the Enterprise operations plan, because another of the Yorktown aviators, Lieutenant Sam Adams, had found Hiryu while the previous strikes were in progress. Therefore, with good intelligence as to the location of the remnants of the Japanese carriers, Enterprise, followed by Hornet, launched on that location. But at this point, the concern about task force defense was such that American strike went out completely minus fighter escort. They lost a couple of SBDs to the Japanese fighters, but destroyed Hiryu in the process, and recovered just before dark. And at that point, without really knowing it, the battle was decided.
4 Japanese carriers gone, and with them their irreplaceable pilots. Yorktown was finished, but so too were Japanese plans to dominate the Eastern Pacific. The American fleet had earned one of the most decisive victories in naval history. The balance of power in the Pacific had been evened. Admiral Yamamoto's prophecy of running wild in the Pacific for 6 months had been fulfilled almost to the day. Although it was not clear as the Battle of Midway ended, the defeat placed the Japanese on the strategic defensive for the remainder of the war. The question then, in June of 1942, was how to further strike at the Japanese before they could regain their equilibrium. The answer was to go on the offensive, to project our fleet and land forces across the Pacific and bring the fight to the enemy. Yet the biggest problem remained: just where would this offensive take place? After Coral Sea, it became clear that the Japanese would eventually attempt to sever lines of communication between Hawaii and Australia. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the Southwest Pacific Forces, favored a strike from Australia against the Japanese in the New Britain, New Ireland areas, with emphasis placed on the reduction of Rabaul. This would force the Japanese to fall back to truck. However, MacArthur did not possess the resources necessary to launch such an offensive. Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, believed the immediate objective should be in the Santa Cruz and Solomon Islands, with the ultimate objective New Guinea and New Britain. The establishment of bases in the Santa Cruz and Solomon Islands would allow a buildup of power for future operations while taking pressure off shipping lanes. Ultimately, it was decided to pursue both routes in an effort to dissipate Japanese resources. The American Navy and Marine Corps would seize and defend Tulagi and the surrounding area, while MacArthur made a parallel advance on New Guinea. The operation was dubbed Pestilence and divided into 3 specific phases. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet and Pacific Ocean Area, was given responsibility for Task 1, which included the seizure of the Santa Cruz Islands and Tulagi. MacArthur was named to execute Tasks 2 and 3, the capture of the Northern Solomons and Rabaul. Codenamed Operation Watchtower, this first offensive was ordered on July 2nd, 1942. The unpredictable forces of war began to link the United States with Guadalcanal in late May 1942, when advance echelons of the 1st Marine Division embarked for the South Pacific. Destination, New Zealand. Mission, undetermined. Somewhere on some unspecified battleground, sometime in the uncertain future, the untested Marines would clash with the tested soldiers of Japan. But first, the tedious ordeal of the convoy, uneventful, interminable weeks at sea.
They loaded us in San Francisco. It was probably mid or late June. aboard the Kungsholm, which was a Swedish luxury liner. And they had us stacked in there like sardines.
Ship just smelled like hell, and they're always afraid of Japanese slant-eyed periscopes showing up someplace, so you had to be in the hold, and there was the doors shut and no lights, and 6 guys, and if the top guy got ill, then it started a kind of a chain reaction down through there. It took 18 days, and it wasn't totally pleasant.
We took off. We didn't know where we were going, but we were going west. And after just a day or two, the firebox, the brick lining of the firebox started falling out. So we fell out of the convoy and sat there with the engine off for about 48 hours while we, the Seabees, went down and pulled the, after we had to wait till it cooled down, and then we got in it and relined it.
The ocean lifeline to the South Pacific was the war's longest and most tenuous. Stretching more than 6,500 miles from California to New Zealand, it tied Australia to the United States. If this supply line were broken, Australia and Asia would be forever Japanese. Across the world, other convoys, other soldiers left for the unknown and sailed away to war. They, too, set a southerly course for islands with names unfamiliar to the men who would fight and die on them. Some would join in the campaign in New Guinea and the Admiralty Islands. Others would continue the advance through the Solomon Chain. For them, too, the routine of shipboard life was a tranquil prelude to carnage. The voyage from San Francisco to Wellington took about 3 weeks, and the quality of the food being served did little to improve conditioning.
They were serving chicken that was green. Well, you know, I'd been around a while, and I wasn't about to do with anything like that. So I'd say 80% of the guys were deathly ill with diarrhea, with all kinds of things because of food. Most of us who didn't get sick were living on Pepsi-Cola and peanuts, and that's the way it went all the way to Wellington, New Zealand.
The advance echelon of the 1st Marine Division arrived at Wellington in mid-June. The Marines were to begin training for a future campaign in the Pacific and didn't expect to see any action for another 6 months. They were green, many of them fresh out of boot camp. Training and campsites had been selected before the Marines' arrival by a small group of officers working in conjunction with the New Zealand military. Ideally chosen, the campsites were in close proximity to good training areas. Early in July, a lone American plane set in motion a chain of events that would bring American and Japanese forces together at a place that neither side had foreseen. On obscure Guadalcanal, air reconnaissance confirmed what radio intelligence had earlier discovered. The Japanese were building an airfield. What the plane had seen changed the course of the Pacific War. This discovery redirected Operation Watchtower from the Santa Cruz Islands to Guadalcanal and Tulagi, with the assault to take place on August 1st, less than a month away. The new target was prophetically codenamed Cactus. No one on either side could have predicted the grueling 6-month struggle that would ensue. Suddenly, the training program was canceled. The Marines of the 1st Division were abruptly alerted and given the mission. Objections to an August invasion by Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley and Marine General Archer Vandegrift, the local commanders, were futile. However, they did gain one concession from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The landing would be put off for 1 week to the 7th of August. Navy planners began the immense task of gathering the necessary ships and material in the ports of New Zealand and Australia. Vandegrift had been placed in an extremely difficult position. His division was fragmented, with 1/3 in Samoa, 1/3 in Wellington, and 1/3 still at sea. Most of his men had been in uniform less than 6 months. His equipment was mostly outdated, and what was new hadn't been broken in. But by far his most pressing concern was to find out something, anything, about Guadalcanal. Seen from the sky, Guadalcanal was a beautiful island, about 90 miles in length and 25 miles wide at its waist. But from the ground, the picture was quite different. Her jungles were nearly impenetrable and were alive with a myriad of insect and animal life.
General Vandegrift's problem was that they had no hard intelligence or maps on Guadalcanal. So they did the best they could. They interviewed anyone they could find who had any knowledge or information on Guadalcanal. Plantation owners, missionaries, sea captains, anyone who could tell them anything about the island. They then used those interviews as the basis from which they formed maps and also their first operational plans.
Speed was essential. Vandegrift and his staff had only a matter of days in which to formulate their plan, toughen up the troops in final training to stage a rehearsal of the attack, and to complete the 7-day trip to Guadalcanal. Supplies commercially loaded stateside would have to be unloaded, sorted, and combat loaded. As time grew short, the Marines were pressed into loading duties.
We were put to work loading ammo onto the, I think it was the Macaulay.
We worked 4 hours on and 4 hours off around the clock, unloading and combat loading the ships. We seemed to have everything we needed. I was just a kid, a buck private. I didn't know what was in those ships or what difference combat loading was from any other kind of loading.
There was no liberty. If you wanted liberty, you went over the side. And I recall specifically, of course, I wasn't what you'd call a real good soldier. Going ashore, having a steak and eggs.
I just couldn't see being that far away from home and not getting to see anything. So I went over the fence a couple of times to go into town and see what it was like. And fortunately, I lucked out and didn't get caught, but it was a beautiful town, nice people.
On July 22nd, the 1st Division set sail for the Fiji Islands, where it would stage an invasion rehearsal under the scrutiny of Marine Generals Vandegrift and Rupertus and Vice Admiral Kelly Turner, who commanded the amphibious task force. Yet another convoy, but this time it was different. This convoy, loaded in gear, sailed for battle. For the first few days, the seas were placid, but this condition was not to prevail.
Between Wellington and the Fijis, as I understood it, was the roughest seas around anywhere. And I'm telling you, that was one boat ride.
The waves must have been 50 or 60 feet high. We were on the Macaulay, which was the flagship where General Vandegrift was. Down in the hold, we had some tanks. One of those tanks broke loose and started rolling around and bashing into the side of the ship. But it was just a horrible storm. We had a little single-stack destroyer that apparently carried messages around the fleet, and it came over by every day, at least once a day, and shot a line over and passed something across the line. And it came during that storm, and a wave caught it and swept it in against the side of the ship, and it bashed up one of the gun mounts on the ship, and then it slid away when the wave went back. And there was just a puff of smoke came out of that stack, and that little APD just took off like a striped-assed ape. And I don't remember just where it was, but somewhere along the way, some more ships joined us, and there were more combat-type ships in that other group.
Admiral Jack Fletcher had sortied earlier from Hawaii. His ships included carriers Saratoga and Enterprise, battleship North Carolina, 6 cruisers, 16 destroyers, and 3 oilers. After he rendezvoused with Wasp and other warships then at sea, the force numbered 89 ships, the greatest invasion armada yet assembled. By July 26th, the combined fleet stood off Coro, a small island in the Fijis, which had been selected as the rehearsal area. That same day, the top American commanders met aboard Fletcher's flagship, Saratoga. Admiral Fletcher, who had been delegated overall command of the operation by Gormley, dropped a bombshell. The carriers that were to provide air cover would be withdrawn after 2 days because of the danger of air attacks. Admiral Turner, who was to command the amphibious force, and General Vandegrift, commander of the landing force, were outraged. Each man pleaded with Fletcher to alter his plans, that a minimum of 5 days air cover was barely sufficient. But Fletcher's mind was made up. He was leaving with his carriers on the 3rd day. Practice landings on Coro did little to alleviate the shock administered on Saratoga. Naval gunfire was inaccurate and dive bombers missed their targets. High surf conditions and offshore coral prevented many boats from landing on designated beaches, while others broke down.
The cargo nets were something else. We had never been trained to do this. With a 50-pound pack on your back to go up and down those cargo nets was something else. A lot of guys got hurt, fell, might fall in between the boat, that is the ship, and the landing craft. It was dangerous.
Turner and Vandegrift were disappointed, but optimistic that a poor rehearsal preceded a good performance, and took what steps they could to rectify the problems. On July 31st, the ships of Fletcher's task force assumed anti-submarine cruising disposition and set a course west by south. That evening, as the sun slipped toward the horizon, its dull red disk resembled the Japanese battle flag. Amateur soothsayers speculated what this omen might portend. None knew with certainty that it marked the setting of the rising sun. In late July, observers forecast a cold front sweeping northeastward toward Guadalcanal at a speed of 300 miles a day. Under cover of the bad weather, the assault force was able to move into enemy-controlled waters with little chance of detection. On board the transports, the men made final preparations and received landing assignments and briefings.
We were given orientation on the way, and it was strange because they didn't know anything about Guadalcanal. We were told there were no snakes, there was no wildlife that would create any problem.
They decided that I was going to be a machine gunner in the Higgins boat, so I got to spend most of the time sitting out on the deck loading the drums for the Lewis gun. I don't know much about Lewis guns. I never shot the thing, but I really can't believe that it would be a very reliable weapon. At least not the way I loaded it.
Before dawn on August 7th, the amphibious task force separated into 2 groups as it approached Savo Island, one bound for Guadalcanal and the other Tulagi.
As I recall, they got us up about 3 o'clock in the morning and fed us a big steak dinner, which I sure didn't need, but maybe somebody enjoyed it. And then we assembled on the deck, I guess, somewhere around dawn.
Escorting the amphibious force were 8 cruisers and a destroyer screen under Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, who deployed his ships northeast and southwest of Savo to protect the transports from the incursion of enemy submarines and aircraft. 100 miles to the south, Admiral Fletcher's carrier group turned slowly into the wind. 1 hour before sunrise, the great ships began launching their planes. The pattern of future campaigns in the Pacific was about to be demonstrated on the beaches of Tulagi and Guadalcanal. The Japanese were not aware that the enemy was upon them. The first shells from the cruiser Quincy's turrets hurled America's reply to the nation that contrived Pearl Harbor. August 7th, 1942, the United States of America takes the offensive against the Empire of Japan.
Daylight, they started shelling the islands, Guadalcanal and Tulagi, and there were planes in the air bombing the area over there where they found the concentrations at, I guess.
We figured that was going to chase them all away and put them all down. It looked to us like they were doing a pretty good job.
6- and 8-inch naval guns spouted flame as thousands of tense Marines began to move slowly down the cargo nets suspended from the decks of the transports.
had to climb down the rope landing nets down the side of the ship and try and time the surge of the Higgins boat with the roll of the ship so that when you stepped off the landing net, you hit the boat instead of falling in the water between the boat and the ship. And fortunately, I think most of us made it.
The bombardment continued. Shells splintered trees and fragments of steel tore viciously into the earth. Through the columns of smoke that rose from shore, Navy dauntlesses dove relentlessly and Avengers skimmed in low.
Well, it was pretty scary, I'll tell you. They loaded about 4 Higgins boats at a time, and they'd go out and they'd load the next 4, and then they'd go out and circle, and they'd go out. When they got the Higgins boats all loaded, they spread out and all went in and hit the beach at the same time in different areas.
Out on the bay, the landing boats were fanning out in assault waves, and when the signal was given, the run to the beach commenced. 11,000 Marines would go ashore in the first amphibious assault by U.S. forces since 1898. The day of hit and run in the Pacific was over. The hour of hit and stay had come. The first Marines ashore in the campaign to capture the Solomons landed not on Guadalcanal, but on Tulagi. Just 2 miles long and half a mile wide, its proximity to nearby Florida Island made the capture of certain key features on Florida essential. A promontory on Florida overlooked the landing beach on Tulagi. It was feared that Japanese artillery could wreak havoc on the amphibious force if this strategic point remained in Japanese hands. In addition to Tulagi, 2 small enemy-held islets, Gavutu and Tanambogo, were also to be seized. The 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines landed unopposed near the village of Halita on Florida Island. They quickly reached the desired promontory and successfully secured the flank. The landing at Tulagi went off as scheduled at 0800.
Where I landed at, we had to wade. We jumped over the side and had to wade waist deep on into the island because it was coral. And I'll tell you, it was pretty rough with a pack on your back. And of course, I didn't have a gun. They didn't give us guns when we first went out there. But we had a pretty heavy pack on our back with our medical supplies. And Red Cross on your shoulder, which we got rid of. They were using them for targets. There wasn't much contact with the Japs until we got inland about 100 yards.
Upon reaching the shore, the 1st Raider Battalion and the 2nd Battalion 5th Marines began to make their way inland. The Raiders encountered Japanese resistance almost immediately. During the first day's action, the Raiders advanced toward the southeastern tip of Tulagi. At dusk, the units consolidated and dug in for the night.
That first night on Tulagi was indicative of what the Marines would face throughout the campaign in the Pacific. The Japanese launched 4 different counterattacks, which were all thrown back, but the ferocity of those attacks was really shocking to the Marines.
Over the next day and a half, the Raiders continued their push down the island. A cave complex and dug-in positions at the base of a deep man-made cut provided the most intense fighting on Tulagi.
First casualty I got was a boy that was shot right through the jaw. And he was in pretty bad shape. I found out later that he didn't make it. They loaded him back on the Higgins boat and took him back out to the ship, but he didn't make it.
By the evening of August 9th, effective Japanese resistance on Tulagi had been eliminated. Gavutu and Tanambogo, connected by a causeway and each with prominent hills held by Japanese forces, were to be seized by 2 companies of the Marine 1st Parachute Battalion. The plan called for an amphibious assault to capture Gavutu before mounting an attack on Tanambogo over the causeway. Problems were immediately encountered when the assault boats were forced to divert from their intended landing area at a concrete seaplane ramp. Naval shelling prior to the invasion was so devastating that it had completely destroyed the original landing site. Forced to divert farther north, the paramarines found themselves pinned down by fire from 3 sides. Casualties were taken, but gradually the Marines gained the upper hand. By 1800, the American flag flew over Gavutu, but above Tanambogo, a rising sun banner whipped defiantly.
The plan was to attack Tanambogo across the causeway between the 2 islands, but heavy machine gun fire from the island prevented that from occurring. So General Rupertus, who was in charge of the operation, elected to do an amphibious landing at dusk. The difficulty was that the naval gunfire preceding that assault hit a gasoline dump and set it on fire. Now, as the Marine landing came in, they were silhouetted against those flames and were forced to withdraw under heavy fire from the Japanese defenders.
The following day, Tanambogo was inundated by a series of naval and aerial attacks. Tragically, bombs from Navy Dauntlesses fell short of their target, and several Marines on Gavutu were killed or wounded. Naval shelling proved more reliable, as first the destroyer San Juan and later Buchanan swept in to blast Japanese positions. At 1600, just minutes after Buchanan's devastating bombardment, the Marines landed on Tanambogo to little opposition. About 750 Japanese had died defending Tulagi and Gavutu Tanambogo, while 144 Americans were killed and nearly 200 wounded. The capture of the islands had not been costly as measured by the heartless business of war, yet it seemed so when compared with what faced the men scheduled to land on Guadalcanal. At 0910, landing craft carrying the 1st and 3rd Battalions, 5th Marines, jarred to a stop on Beach Red, Guadalcanal.
The landing itself, completely unopposed. There was nobody on the beach when we got there. We did hear some firing, and it was Seabees that had been on the beach for hours before we got there that were shooting coconuts out of trees. We were supposed to be scared, and we were, till we found out, hell, there was nothing there.
We hit the beach and walked up the beach into the brush. It really is a beautiful place. It's one of the most gorgeous spots I've ever seen.
The Marines were stunned. Many had expected to fight for their lives from behind a barricade formed from the bodies of fallen pals. Instead, they had literally walked ashore on a seeming tropical paradise. Intelligence reports had estimated that there were more than 5,000 Japanese on the island, when in reality, there were fewer than 2,000. Vandegrift's desire to land where the enemy was ill-prepared had been realized. By 0930, the assault forces were ashore and moving inland. By necessity, Vandegrift's plan was not complex. The 5th Marines were to proceed along the coast to secure the flank, while the 1st Marines would move inland along the Tenaroo River and secure a grassy knoll identified as Mount Austin that lay a short distance from Beach Red.
We're supposed to be heading up into the mountains. There was some kind of a Japanese lookout up in the mountains, and our objective was to go take that, but we never got into the mountains at all.
Mount Austin lay several miles inland, and attempts to reach it that first day were ultimately aborted. Until midday, debarkation continued without a hitch, but this soon began to change. Supplies began to pile up alarmingly on the beach. There were simply not enough hands ashore to keep pace with the materials that streamed from the transports. Even as the Americans were establishing their first foothold in the Solomons, the Japanese were preparing to push them out. From Rabaul, the Japanese sent 27 twin-engine bombers covered by 18 Zeros to harass the American invaders. Fortunately for the transports, the planes were armed with bombs rather than torpedoes. The raid, which came in at 12:30 hours, damaged one destroyer before departing. While positions along the shore were prepared and supplies piled up, the Marines continued their advance.
The whole countryside there was either coconut groves or big high grass fields. Grass, well, some of it as high as your head. And it was just miserable going. And So we struggled along pulling our communications carts and dragging everything, and I guess by the end of the day we got back up, just starting back up into the hills.
The password went out, and there was some shooting going on in the night, but it was mostly between guards that were set up on the perimeter and people that didn't know or had forgotten the password. I don't think anybody got hurt, but they very well could have.
August 8th began with a westward advance by all Marine forces on Guadalcanal. The 5th Marines continued toward Lunga Point, while the 1st Marines swung toward the Lunga River and approached the airfield from the south. Contact with small groups of Japanese began to occur as the Marines closed in on the airfield, but resistance was quickly overrun, and by 1600, the Marines had taken the airstrip.
The airstrip was essentially a wide spot in the road and was only marginally useful at the time that the Marines occupied that area, and was badly in need of improvement with pierced steel planking called Marston matting, or with gravel that could extend the useful length of the runway.
2 enemy camps and a large amount of equipment were also captured. Weapons left by the retreating Japanese were of special interest, among them the only flamethrowers that would appear in the campaign for Guadalcanal. Japanese trucks were put to use in hauling supplies from the beachhead, and large caches of food, chiefly rice, would prove invaluable in the coming days. At 12:30 hours, there was another Japanese air raid. A formation of 40 Japanese dive and torpedo bombers flew into a literal storm of steel thrown up by warships near Tulagi. Those that escaped the intense anti-aircraft fire were fallen upon by fighters from WASP, but one plane managed to send a torpedo crashing into the side of destroyer Jarvis. Another crashed through an open hatch on the transport Elliott, setting the ship ablaze. Unable to extinguish the fire, Elliott was scuttled later that day. All but one of the 45 bombers that made the attack was shot down. The surviving pilot landed at Rabaul and announced he had sunk a battleship.
This tendency to exaggerate their successes wasn't a Japanese problem alone. However, it was extreme in the Japanese case. This seems to rise out of their code of Bushido. Their individual warrior status tends to make them exaggerate their successes and underestimate their enemy. And this is going to cost them over and over again throughout the war in the Pacific.
Prior to the air raid, a force of Japanese ships was spotted steaming toward Guadalcanal. The report passed through 7 separate communication relays before reaching Guadalcanal, and by then, even the direction of the Japanese had become confused. Under the command of Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, the task force approached unchecked. By nightfall on August 8th, the beach had extended a mile inland and 4 miles along the shore. The Marines owned the airstrip and nearly all the ground required to defend it. Vandegrift and his staff had reason to feel optimistic, but that feeling was not to last. Summoned aboard the Macaulay by Rear Admiral Richmond Turner, Vandegrift learned that Task Force 61, including all 3 aircraft carriers, had withdrawn due to fuel shortage and aircraft losses. Fletcher's departure left Turner with no choice. He would have to withdraw the amphibious task force, less than half unloaded, the following day. Although Admiral Crutchley would remain with his force of cruisers and destroyers, Fletcher's early withdrawal left Vandegrift and Turner, as the latter eloquently put it, bare ass. While Mikawa was advancing at 26 knots, Crutchley's ships assumed their night dispositions. Due to the 3 entrances to the Sound, the Allied forces were compelled to divide into 3 patrolling squadrons: Southern, Northern, and Eastern. Behind the screen of warships, the transports lay off Lunga Point. When Mikawa's force slipped unseen past the 2 destroyer pickets at the mouth of the Sound, the stage was set for the U.S. Navy's most humiliating defeat. Using standard Japanese tactics, Mikawa first launched torpedoes. At 0145, a pair found the Australian ship Canberra. 6 and 8-inch gunfire followed, and Canberra was finished. Moments later, the heavy cruiser Chicago was hit, and while she managed to limp away, Chicago failed to report that an attack was underway. 15 minutes later, the Japanese fell upon the northern force, cruising sedately along in patrol formation. Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria were quickly gunned into sinking hulks. Crutchley's fleet became the first layer of steel in what would become known as Iron Bottom Sound.
After Admiral Mikawa defeats the American Navy off Savo Island, the transports, who are unloading at Lunga Point, are completely defenseless. However, he elects at that point to withdraw because he is afraid of an American carrier strike with the first light. Now, obviously, if he had known that the American carriers had already withdrawn, he would have continued and destroyed the transports and leaving the Marines completely at the mercy of the Japanese Navy.
August 9th, Marines watched as Allied vessels picked up survivors and then slipped away through columns of smoke from the still burning remains of the American fleet.
People were washing up ashore. Some of them were swimming ashore. I don't know how many boats were sunk out there. I think I've read since then, but it was kind of a mess as far as our Navy was concerned.
In the Battle of Savo Island, 700 men were wounded and nearly 1,100 perished. For the American Navy, it was the worst disaster since Pearl Harbor. In just half an hour, the Japanese had changed the entire picture of an easy American victory at Guadalcanal. Virtually defenseless, the battered American Navy had no choice but to withdraw. When the last ships left, late on the 9th, General Vandegrift's Marines were all alone.
All the ships pulled out, and they weren't done unloading yet, but they just all bailed out on us, and by mid-afternoon they were all gone. So we did feel kind of halfway abandoned, and to be real honest, we didn't see any more American ships for a long time.
The Marines really were left on a shoestring, and they started calling the Guadalcanal operation not Operation Watchtower, but Operation Shoestring, because supplies were so much in demand.
The withdrawal of the transports had left the Marines with only part of their supplies, and now, with no air cover, it became imperative to get what supplies had come ashore off the beaches where they were extremely vulnerable to attack. No air support would be available until the airfield was completed, and that task was made difficult by a lack of proper equipment, most of which had sailed away before it could be unloaded. Forced to employ Japanese equipment to improve the runway, the engineers' task was further complicated by the unrivaled Japanese air superiority. Operating from bases in the northern and central Solomons, Japanese planes dominated the skies.
Japanese land-based naval aviation was eventually built almost exclusively around a Mitsubishi design that they called the G4M, and which we called the Betty. It was a fairly large twin-engine aircraft capable of delivering either bombs or torpedo. Excellent range, good turn of speed, I'd say close to 280 knots or so. But its crews learned early on that it was highly susceptible to sustained battle damage, and for that reason it was called not only the Type 1 land attack aircraft, but the Type 1 lighter. And that big thick wing contained an awful lot of high-octane fuel, and if that gets ignited, well, the trip is over.
The problem at Guadalcanal was that the Japanese had the ability to come down and bomb it from both Bougainville and Rabaul.
The Japanese unleashed full fury from the sky. They went all out to destroy the airfield, planning to retake it later.
We didn't have any air support at all, so the Japs were free to do whatever they wanted to do from an aerial standpoint.
5 days after the landing, the airstrip was ready, and the Marines christened it Henderson Field to honor a fallen buddy. The field was designed and construction started by the Japanese, and it was completed with captured equipment, but the planes that would use it were American. That same day, it received its first American aircraft, a Navy Catalina, with a survey party aboard, flown in to inspect the field. Upon their examination, the field was declared ready for use. On the trip out, 2 men were evacuated, thus establishing what would be the primary means of medical evacuation from the island. General Vandegrift believed the Japanese were certain to take advantage of the Marines' predicament and launch an attack. Perimeter defenses were thus improved and patrols sent out to probe for the enemy. One of these patrols, led by Colonel Frank Getke, was ambushed as it approached Matanical Village on August 13. Only 3 of the unit's 25 men survived, and they reported lurid stories of Japanese brutality.
Some of the stuff you kind of wiped out of your memories. It just wasn't pleasant to see. How they'd cut up some of the people and just left them lay, disemboweled them. It was something you didn't want to remember, that kind of stuff. And I suppose what it did was kind of turn you on a little bit, that you wanted to be as mean as they were.
On August 15th, British Captain Martin Clemens came to Vandegrift's headquarters to put himself at the general's service. He organized a scouting force made up of natives that provided a valuable source of information throughout the campaign.
Before the arrival of the Americans on Guadalcanal, Clemens had been supplying them information about Japanese movements in and around the island. And he was doing this as part of the Coast Watcher network. The Coast Watchers were a network of men established on the islands who were, with small radios, supplying information to the Australians on the movement of the Japanese throughout the area. And the information that these Coast Watchers provided on Japanese aerial and naval movements was absolutely essential to Allied success in this campaign.
Since the destruction of Getke's patrol, Vandegrift had wanted to eliminate the threat west of the river. On August 19th, 3 companies of the 5th Marines attacked west against the Japanese concentrated near Matanical Village. In the first battle of the Matanical, the Marine attack destroyed the small Japanese garrison. That same day, a patrol was sent to investigate reports of Japanese activity east of the Marine perimeter. It stumbled into a Japanese reconnaissance party, and in the ensuing firefight, 31 Japanese were killed. A search of the bodies afterward revealed helmets marked with the Japanese Army star rather than the Navy's chrysanthemum, leaving no doubt that infantry troops were being filtered ashore. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki's force of 900 men landed a day earlier at Taivu Point, well east of the airfield's defenses. At the same time, 500 more went ashore to the west at Kokumbona. These landings were the first run of what the Marines came to call the Cactus Express, a nightly run of cruisers, destroyers, and transports that shuttled troops and supplies to Guadalcanal. Later known as the Tokyo Express, these operations achieved the regularity of a crack railroad run. As defenses were being improved to guard against an attack from the east, the familiar sound of incoming aircraft signaled the Marines to start for their foxholes. However, these planes had come to land at Henderson Field, not to bomb it. The arrival of 12 Marine Dauntlesses and 19 Wildcats provided a tremendous boost for the men on the ground.
When Lieutenant Colonel Dick Mangrum and Major John L. Smith arrived with their SBDs and F-4Fs, it immediately gave a huge boost to morale among the Marine infantrymen on Guadalcanal, who had become accustomed to seeing only airplanes with rising suns painted on their wings. But now there were white-starred airplanes, and even though They arrived without much maintenance capability. At least they were able to start intercepting the Japanese daily bombing raids.
After we got some planes, that made all the difference in the world. Then from then on, they kept building up our Air Force, and it got to where it was a pretty respectable unit after a while.
Across the Tenarue, Ichiki was preparing his troops to retake the airfield. Early on the morning of August 21st, he gathered his men at the mouth of the river. Colonel Ichiki's force of 900 men, landed on the 18th, was to be joined later by 1,500 more. But Ichiki had been given orders that permitted him to attack whenever he saw fit. Intelligence reports indicated that the American presence on the island was no greater than a raiding party cowering in a defensive perimeter around the airfield. With the element of surprise lost through the encounter east of the Tenarue, Ichiki decided to attack. At 01:30, the Japanese charged across the Tenarue with bayonets fixed. The Marines were ready for it.
We had one thing going for us. We had 37 millimeter guns with canister loads. That canister load is a load of essentially buckshot cast, I think, in beeswax. And there's an awful lot of shot there, and it spreads like a sawed-off shotgun. And we had 2 or 3 of those dug in covering that sand spit, plus machine guns and everything else. And it was just an absolute massacre.
It was almost like a turkey shoot as the Japanese came across and were going to try to get across the river, almost at the mouth of the river where you could wade in the sand, but it was a slaughterhouse there.
Greatly outnumbered at the point of attack, the Japanese were cut down on the banks of the Tenarue. Only a few dazed bands survived, and at morning light, the Marines crossed the shallow river to carry the attack.
They moved the 2nd Battalion around behind them to trap them, and then they just started shelling the bejesus out of the spot they were in. Some of them were trying to swim away, and it was a case of not so much can you get him, but who can get him first. And then they brought the tanks up, and the tanks moved out into this little peninsula sort of area where they were, and the tanks thrashed around out there, flushing them out. And they just were heaped up on the sand spit at the mouth of the river.
By dusk, nearly 800 Japanese, including Colonel Ichiki, were dead. Somehow only 44 Marines were lost. Henderson had been defended for the first time, and the planes, which had arrived the day before, were safe.
The battle at the Tenarue is actually fought on Alligator Creek, which is a tributary of the Ilu River. And this just points out once again how poor American intelligence was on the terrain of the island. But the real importance of the Battle of the Tenarue is that the Marines were able to just crushingly defeat the Japanese. And the Japanese at this point had a reputation as tenacious and ferocious fighters. And this victory goes a long way in boosting Marine morale.
Ichiki's failure prompted Admiral Yamamoto to stage a more determined effort to drive the Americans from the island. The 1,500 men that were to reinforce Ichiki again sailed for Guadalcanal, and on August 21st rendezvoused with a powerful task force sent to support operations ashore. Yamamoto hoped to draw the American fleet into battle and planned to detach a diversionary group baited with the carrier Ryujo to attract the American flat tops. Fletcher's carrier groups, built around Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, had been patrolling south of the Solomons since August 9th, outside the range of Japanese search aircraft. Based on radio traffic analysis, Fletcher was aware that a large Japanese force had sailed.
Starting with the Battle of Midway, the Japanese are much more efficient about changing their codes, and those efforts kind of forestall American moves to gain intelligence by breaking their codes. but we're still able to gather intelligence from traffic analysis. And by that I mean from the amount and frequency of radio traffic, we can define the amount of activity being carried out by the Japanese, but we are no longer able to tell what the intention of that activity is.
Intelligence gathering was further complicated by the vast reaches of the Pacific. Before an attack could be mounted, the target had to be located. Both sides relied on aerial reconnaissance to fix enemy positions.
In carrier warfare, job one was find the opposition, because that gave you enormous advantage. Not only could you position your forces for maximum benefit, but you could usually get in the first lick. Most of our reconnaissance was done by carrier aircraft, whereas the Japanese preferred to retain their strike aircraft for attack missions, and therefore they devoted usually more than half of their reconnaissance sorties to cruiser or battleship-based float planes, which were fired off catapults and recovered well underway and picked up out of the water with a crane. Both sides, of course, had flying boats that had enormous range and time on station, but those were not always available in the carrier phases of the battle. So both sides knew that reconnaissance was important. You have to know where the enemy is in order to get in the first lick, but it's just the platforms that the Japanese chose to emphasize is what made them different from the American perspective.
Bound for Guadalcanal, the Japanese transport convoy was located by Catalina's search planes on August 20th. However, the supporting task force went undetected. A dispatch from SINCPAC indicated all Japanese carriers were north of Truk. In light of this report, WASP departed to refuel on the 23rd. The following day, the opposing forces located each other, and as Yamamoto had hoped, Ryujo drew the attention of the Americans.
Japanese doctrine was extremely complex. The Japanese were great believers in dispersion and in decoy forces, and they kept to that pattern absolutely throughout the war, for as long as they had a viable navy.
As American air groups left in pursuit of Ryujo, their plan of attack was largely dictated by the performance characteristics of the aircraft they flew.
It was preferable for the dive bombers to attack first, so that their bomb hits and even the near misses could be of use in reducing enemy visibility, would make it easier for the torpedo planes to make their approach, which of necessity was at very low level, often as low as 50 feet, at perhaps 120, 130 knots, very low speed. The third element in the equation was the fighter aircraft, both friendly and enemy. The purpose of the escorting fighters was to engage the enemy's defending fighters and, as much as possible, keep them away from friendly dive bombers and especially from torpedo planes, which really had very little room to maneuver.
The wisdom of fighter cover was proven emphatically at Midway, where unescorted U.S. torpedo squadrons were decimated by the Japanese. But in spite of improved air cover, problems still plagued American aviators.
We started out what they call a TBD, and that was made by Douglas. But most of them got wiped out in Midway. We were one of the first squadrons that got TBMs, and they were a good deal faster. They were built, they took a bad beating and still flew. And the problem we had with the torpedo planes was we didn't use them much because we didn't have good torpedoes. We had to slow up to 200 knots at 200 feet, no higher than 200 feet. But you had to go in a definite pattern so that they'd converge theoretically. And then the torpedoes didn't run right.
At 1550, the attack on Ryujo began. Dauntless dive bombers from Saratoga fell on the hapless carrier, scoring several hits. Then Avengers came in from different directions so that no matter which way she turned, the enemy carrier would still be exposed to their torpedoes. Ryujo never had a chance, but she had served Yamamoto's purpose. Admiral Nagumo, commander of the carrier force, ordered his planes aloft, certain that the Americans had flown off all their planes to attack Ryujo. Admiral Fletcher, however, had not forgotten the lessons of the Coral Sea or Midway, and he had 53 Wildcats aloft, waiting. The initial exchange was strictly a pilot's battle, as American and Japanese planes tangled outside the gun range of Enterprise and her screen of escorts. Dive-bombing Vals and torpedo-launching Kates, covered by a screen of Zeros, scrimmaged wildly with the American planes. At 1641, the Japanese dive bombers commenced their run. American ships opened up on the tiny silhouettes of the Japanese planes. Wildcats slashed at them as they came down, risking friendly anti-aircraft fire. But the Japanese pilots never faltered. Enterprise twisted and turned, trying to avoid the coming onslaught. But at 1714, a 1,000-pound bomb crashed through her aft elevator, penetrating to the third deck before it exploded. Moments later, a second bomb caused a tremendous fire and explosion when it hit 5-inch powder bags stored below deck. A mile and a quarter astern of Enterprise, North Carolina also drew the interest of the enemy pilots. At least 10 Vals made a coordinated attack on the battleship, but their bombs splashed harmlessly in the water. The Japanese attack, which missed Saratoga completely, was over in a matter of minutes. Enterprise, listing and pouring out smoke, still raced along at 27 knots. Damage control focused on extinguishing the blaze set by the second bomb. Men with hoses played streams of water on the flames, while others spread foam to smother burning oil. An hour after the attack, Enterprise turned into the wind to receive aircraft.
To a certain extent, Eastern Solomons is one of the archetypal carrier battles that has ever been fought. It was not a major battle by later standards, or even certainly compared to what had already transpired at Coral Sea and Midway, but within the Guadalcanal campaign itself, it pretty much set the pattern for the next several months. We now had on both sides combat experienced aviators, some of whom had been in one or more of the previous carrier battles, and you also had a growing institutional experience with the ship's companies and commanders such as Nagumo and Fletcher, who had fought each other previously.
Had enemy torpedo planes not been successfully driven off, the Big E may have been sunk during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. As it was, the battle ended indecisively. The Japanese had lost Ryujo and a significant number of aircraft and their pilots, but they had succeeded in crippling Enterprise. The most significant fact in the aftermath of the battle was that American planes had turned back the Japanese troop transports, spoiling Yamamoto's plan to dislodge the Americans on Guadalcanal. Following the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, dive bombers from Enterprise landed at Guadalcanal and were there for nearly a month.
Throughout the campaign, Henderson Field became either a divert field or a semi-permanent base for U.S. Navy carrier aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Turner Caldwell led his Dauntlesses into the field as an expedient means of avoiding a night recovery aboard Enterprise, and such was the need by that time that they were immediately absorbed into the generic organization of what became known as the Cactus Air Force, and were significant in the effort to keep Japanese shipping from adequately resupplying enemy forces on Guadalcanal.
During this phase of the campaign, the Army Air Force contributed a squadron of P-400s.
Although it was a fast airplane, something around 350 plus mile per hour, with a potent armament, 20 or 37 millimeter cannon, plus 50 and 30 caliber machine guns. It had very poor altitude performance and consequently was usually limited to missions up around 15,000 feet. The fellas I've known who flew it took sort of a philosophical aspect or view of the endeavor. They like to say that a P-400 was simply a P-40 with a zero behind it.
Another late August arrival was the 6th CB Battalion and the equipment they brought with them.
We arrived one night in the dark, and we circled around out there and had no idea where we were. And then in the next morning, they told us, this is Guadalcanal, and this is where you're going ashore.
In addition to the improvement of Henderson, the Seabees were responsible for a wide variety of construction duties.
Some of our outfit went directly onto Guadalcanal, and some of us went over to Tulagi because Tulagi had a much better harbor. Guadalcanal was exposed. There was no harbor there at all. You had to fight your way through the surf. There had been a little dinky old dock there about probably 200 feet long in the Tulagi harbor. And so we took off right away to extend that dock so that it had, make 900 or 1,000 feet long so you could get a full-size ship coming into it.
As August drew to a close, events on Guadalcanal settled into routine monotony. Daily, the Japanese would stage air raids, but the long flight from Rabaul meant bomber formations could be expected between 11:30 and 14:30.
At certain times of the day, you didn't want to be around Henderson Field. And I mean, it was heavy stuff. It'd shake the ground wherever you were at.
The whole target was the runway, and there'd be between 20 and 30 twin-engine bombers. And every day they came by and dropped their bombs and went away again.
This operational pattern, combined with reports from coast watchers and an air warning radar system, provided just enough time for the Wildcats to gain sufficient altitude.
With the F-4F-4 Wildcat, approximately 45 minutes advance notice was needed in order to scramble the fighters, get them to the altitude they needed, roughly 30,000 feet, in order to be in a favorable position to attack the Japanese bombers before they could actually drop their bombs.
The F-4F Wildcat, the only effective fighter available during this early phase of the campaign, had advantages and disadvantages over its primary adversary, the Japanese Zero.
The advantage, at least to some way of thinking, was that it had been upgunned from a 4 to a 6-gun airplane and had folding wings, which meant that relatively more Wildcats could be embarked aboard an aircraft carrier than previously. However, the extra weight of the two additional 50 caliber guns, their ammunition, and the wingfold mechanism added approximately 500 pounds to the previous F-4F-3 model. And the main disadvantage was not the slight loss in maximum speed, but the lesser rate of climb. The Zero was a very lightweight, extremely agile, very long-ranged fighter aircraft with a fairly potent armament. As with most of the world's air forces, rather than an all-machine gun armament, such as the Americans usually had, the Zero had a combination of 20 millimeter cannon and either 7.7 or 12.7 millimeter machine guns. The Japanese much preferred to go for performance over ruggedness or endurance.
Although the Zero was able to outclimb and outmaneuver the Wildcat, the F-4F was much sturdier, and combat tactics were developed to exploit this advantage. Individual combat was avoided in favor of team tactics.
The quickest ticket to the morgue in a Wildcat was to try to dogfight a Zero. Instead, the doctrine that was absorbed in the Marine squadrons at Guadalcanal was essentially identical to what the Navy squadrons had been practicing since the Battle of Midway. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, the commanding officer of VF-3, which was a Saratoga squadron originally, had developed what he called his beam defense, which is simply a leader and wingman flying line abreast, instead of this echelon step back formation that most of the world's air forces had been using approximately since World War I. Instead of having a leader and a shooter, you have two potential shooters. And Joe Foss, the top Marine Corps ace of the war and the highest scoring Wildcat pilot, said that to him the great advantage of the Thatch Weave is that it let you keep eyes and guns pointed in almost any direction all the time. And because of that air discipline, that teamwork, and the confidence that Navy and Marine Corps pilots developed, they were able to offset the Japanese superior performance with a faster, more maneuverable airplane with better teamwork. And that, combined with the armor plate and the self-sealing tanks that were built into the Wildcat, meant that a slower, less agile airplane could not only survive in that kind of combat arena, but it could win as well.
Flying wing to wing, two Wildcats could more than hold their own against the Zero, and it was thus that the legend of the invincible Japanese Air Force was blasted into flaming wreckage. A curious tactical situation had developed at Guadalcanal as mastery of the seas was exchanged every 12 hours. The Americans ruled during daylight hours as ships unloaded and launches dashed around the Sound. Twilight signaled a quick Allied exodus and the arrival of the Tokyo Express. These troop carriers and their escorts would dash in to discharge soldiers or a freight, and while departing, they would toss a few shells in the Marines' direction.
Yeah, we got some shelling from the sea, and it did blow up a lot of stuff, but luckily we were never in that particular line of fire. We could hear it and we could see it, but we were not embarrassed to dig a foxhole pretty near anywhere we were and get it done real fast so that there was a place where you could dive into if trouble started. Some people made fun of that, but they didn't survive, and we did.
I laid in a foxhole one night, and they was shooting at us with a pretty good-sized gun, and it was sizzling right over the top of our heads and through the coconut trees. And that's pretty scary, laying in a hole, not knowing where the next one's going to hit.
The final land action in August occurred west of the Matanikau River near Point Cruz. The 1st Battalion, 5th Marines landed unopposed, but their move inland was discouraged by the terrain and thick vegetation. As the Marines struggled inland, the Japanese opened fire from concealed positions. American casualties mounted, and the attack was halted until it could be better supported. The attack resumed the next morning, but met no opposition as the Japanese had withdrawn. The last day of August brought more grief to the U.S. Navy, this time in the form of a Japanese torpedo. Stately old Saratoga was steaming on defensive patrol 260 miles southeast of Guadalcanal when she was spotted by a Japanese I-boat. She was smashed by a single torpedo abreast of the island superstructure on the starboard side, and though she was later repaired, Saratoga was out of the fight for Guadalcanal. Vandegrift learned of her loss with a sinking heart, for intelligence reports indicated that the Tokyo Express had been landing troops and supplies with increasing regularity. Major General Kiyotaki Kawaguchi, commander of the 35th Infantry Regiment, had more than 5,000 troops near Taivu Point, more than twice the number of Marines believed to be on the island. While American manpower was grossly underestimated, Kawaguchi could expect to have overwhelming superiority at the point of attack, with the additional advantage of choosing when and where it would occur. Moreover, the Japanese would be facing defenders who were beginning to show the effects of little food and even less rest.
When food gets short, people start getting nasty, you know. We knew we had no support because the food stuff wasn't coming in. We were scrounging. We were finding Japanese rice sacks. They had big woven sacks that you would find out in the brush. So we had that.
the food was a little on the lousy side because it was kind of whatever you could get.
The everyday rations were pretty slim and pretty poor because a good part of our food supply went away with the ships when they left. And so we were eating captured Jap oats that they used to feed their horses and captured Jap rice. I managed to find somewhere, I don't remember where it was, a can of Jap pork and beans packed with seaweed. And I guess I'm not very generous or kind of an animal-like type. I hid my can of pork and beans and sneaked off into a gully and ate it all.
Hunger aside, day-to-day existence on Guadalcanal was difficult in the extreme.
The thing that people will always talk about regarding not just Henderson Field but Guadalcanal is that it was widely held it was the only place on earth where you could stand up to your knees in mud and still have dust blow in your eye.
Living conditions weren't too good. I mean, you slept on the ground. We didn't have tent camps or tents to live in. It was a case of shelter halves and whatever you can rustle up to keep the rain off. Fortunately, we were young and flexible and stupid. Didn't seem to bother us too much, but...
The living conditions for infantry was bad enough at Guadalcanal, which is to say it was appalling. But it was only marginally any better for the first aviators. Bob Gaylor, who was the commanding officer of the 2nd Wildcat Squadron to go ashore, tells the story that he was ashore 3 days before he could wash his hands.
Subject to frequent shelling and constantly under the threat of air attack, the Marines were additionally harassed through a variety of Japanese tactics.
At night, we called them Washing Machine Charlie. It was some kind of a little airplane that made funny noises, and he'd just come flying around, and it just kept everybody awake more than anything else. He never really did any serious damage. He'd always drop one bomb.
The Washing Machine Charlie was a nuisance almost every night. You never knew when he was going to drop a bomb or what he was going to do, and he came in the dark.
But these Japanese attempts to discourage the Marines were not without their lighter moments.
This damn Jap submarine would come every day without fail, and he'd just cruise up and down offshore and shoot at us. We had half-tracks with 75mm guns mounted on them. Every day they'd pull out and go tearing down to the beach to shoot back at him, and they never could hit him. And I guess one day we had an old Marine Corps character. I think he was older than the hills even then. He'd been in Haiti and Nicaragua and God knows where, all China, named Lou Diamond. And he was the master mortarman of all mortarmen that ever were. And he took his mortar platoon down to the beach one day. And he set up that mortar, and damned if he didn't hit that submarine. A mortar is not going to hurt a submarine, but it sure made him submerge.
The enemy buildup east of the Marines' perimeter was centered on the village of Tasimboko. Native scouts had estimated 2,000 to 3,000 Japanese troops were in the area, but these reports were met with skepticism by Marine intelligence. However, as a precautionary measure, it was decided the reports should be investigated. The Marines selected for the job were the 1st Raider and 1st Parachute Battalions, recently arrived from Tulagi. At 0530 on September 8th, the 1st Raiders, under the command of Colonel Merritt Edson, sloshed ashore at Taivu Point. Edson deployed his men to attack west toward Tasimboko, and at about 0800 they made contact with Kawaguchi's rear echelon. Air support was called in, and soon Henderson's aviators were pouring fire on the enemy. The Raiders mounted an enveloping attack, and when it made contact with the enemy, resistance was quickly routed. Edson's men entered the village to find it deserted. Large quantities of material and a large radio station were systematically destroyed. The raid had been a complete success. On September 9th, a new airstrip, Fighter 1, was ready for use. 2,000 yards east of Henderson, the strip was built by the Seabees.
Henderson Field was being used for the heavily laden aircraft, both on landing and takeoff. And the fighters, they didn't want all that traffic on just one runway.
Little more than a field of mown grass, Fighter 1 would provide an extremely important resource in days to come. As September entered its second week, barge convoys to Coimbo Bay had swelled the number of Japanese in the area to nearly 2,000. Under Colonel Oka, they were to coordinate with Kawaguchi's force to attack on September 12th. Planning to move by sea to an area near the Guadalcanal, inadequate shipping crippled the plan. The two Japanese units were 70 miles apart, with dense jungle and American Marines in between. Kawaguchi thus designated Oka's force the left wing and slated them to attack the southwest quarter of the Marine perimeter. The main assault would come from the south, led by Kawaguchi's 3 infantry battalions. The remnants of Ichiki's force, now designated the Kuma Battalion, would attack from the southeast. The Japanese advance began on September 9th, but soon bogged down. Unable to clear more than just a narrow path, the march through the jungle was torturous. Soaked in sweat or drenched by rain, the Japanese plodded on. Ever mindful of exposing their advance, open areas had to be avoided rather than sought. But however slowly, the Japanese were coming. Southwest of Henderson, a broken grassy ridge stretched 1,000 yards through the jungle to the banks of the Lunga River. When the Japanese attacked, Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Thomas and Colonel Edson were convinced it would be there. They presented their conclusions to Vandegrift, and on September 10th, Edson moved the raiders and paratroops to what he jokingly termed a rest area. By 1400, they were fortifying what his men referred to as Edson's Ridge. An air raid the following day confirmed suspicions. When the cry of Condition Red was sounded, Marines stringing barbed wire or hacking out fields of fire kept on working. The target would be, as always, the airfield, but the target was Edson's Ridge. Out in the jungle, the Kawaguchi Brigade took comfort in the sound of Japanese bombs falling, but it was small comfort. Their march had become an agonizing torment. Nevertheless, they pressed on. The following night, they would attack. As the Japanese approached, Marine patrol encounters with the enemy increased in frequency until it became nearly impossible to move outside the perimeter.
The reserve battalion had to provide a company strength patrol every day. The company that had the patrol that day drew double rations. And the radio operators that went with the company got to eat with the company. So we were prone to volunteering with a fair degree of regularity. But anyhow, I was with the company, and we were just short of the river, and the lieutenant said, "This will be the CP," so we set our radio up, and the rest of the company went on, and just a few minutes later, there was just a god-awful firefight broke out. Pretty soon we see these guys running back down the trail. There'd be a couple, and then one, and then a few more. And so we're wondering what is going on, and we're waiting for somebody to come and tell us to pack up and move out. And pretty soon the first sergeant came backing down the trail with his Tommy gun at the ready, and we asked him what's going on, and he turned around and jumped like we'd shot. And, "What the hell are you bastards doing here? Don't you know I'm the only one left between you and them?" And so we debated for 2 seconds over whether to put a grenade in the radio and blow it up or pack it up and take it. And we decided we'd probably get court-martialed if we blew it up, so we packed it up and took it. But it didn't take long to pack.
The Marines on Edson's Ridge drove themselves to complete their fortifications, a series of strong points with overlapping fields of fire. The terrain and denseness of the jungle, combined with the small number of men, precluded anything resembling a continuous line. To the rear, artillery batteries were registered to give Edson's men close support. The only available reserves, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, was moved into supporting positions.
We were designated as the reserve battalion. So as a unit, I suppose we saw more of that island than most of the other units there because of the way they moved us around.
The Marine commanders were certain the enemy was coming that night. It was up to the raiders on the ridge to stop them. At the point of attack, 840 Marines would face over 2,000 Japanese. Below the ridge, Kawaguchi rushed to organize his men. The march through the jungle had scattered his detachments, and another day of preparation was in order. He had assured Rabaul that he would attack on the 12th before his radio was destroyed in the Tasamboko raid. Now, with no means of communication, Kawaguchi was left with no choice. He deployed his men along the Lunga, opposite the Marine right flank, and awaited the naval bombardment that was to precede his attack. 3 hours before midnight on September 12th, 20 minutes of bombardment from ships offshore signaled the beginning of the battle for Edson's Ridge. Machine gun and rifle fire broke out, and the Kawaguchi Brigade came pouring out of the jungle, probing for weak spots in the Marine line. They drove the raiders back and advanced down the Lunga to attempt an encirclement, but they lost their way once they left the riverbank, and mortar and artillery fire drove them back. On the left, the paratroops were struck. Holes were driven through their lines, but the Japanese failed to capitalize. At dawn, the Marines counterattacked, but there were not enough men to carry the fight. Exhausted, Edson's men returned to the line and set about improving their positions.
After this first night on the Bloody Ridge, Colonel Edson will pull the Marines back 100 yards, which will allow him to tighten his perimeter. The defense will be much improved, fields of fire will be improved. The Japanese will have another 100 yards of open ground to attack across, and that gives him some more space to employ his artillery firepower on those attacking Japanese.
By the afternoon of the 13th, Marines on the ridge were sleepwalking after nearly 72 sleepless hours. They had expected to be relieved by Vandergrift's reserve, but air raids prevented this. Several air attacks struck that day. The Cactus Air Force had grown substantially with the arrival of 60 planes, and they raised havoc with the bombers and their escorts. Wildcats from Henderson intercepted a Japanese reconnaissance flight.
The Japanese fighter planes had 30 caliber and 20 millimeters. And the 20 millimeters were very effective, but they were heavy, and their planes were light, and they couldn't carry very many of them. And so our gunners and our fighter planes had an advantage. They sight with tracers when they're on you, and so they would use their 30 caliber tracers to try to sight you. And when you could see the tracers going from red to green or green to red, you knew they'd cut in the 20 millimeter. They thought they had you, kind of, and so you do different maneuvers. But anyway, they could shoot our airplanes up pretty good, and we could still fly. Theirs would fall apart. If they saw a wing or something, you'd see the wings coming down like a pine cone. You love pine cones. You look up and plummet, and then the wings would be floating. We had a great advantage over the Japanese in that. If their airplanes that hit, they were gone. Ours could fly. I was always thankful. That's why at the first of the war, they were always claiming the Japanese were so much more maneuverable, and they had the little zeros, and they could outfight everybody. Well, that's true, but they didn't have any weight, they didn't have any armament, they didn't have nothing in that. All those left. All those were gone pretty soon. I think they just bet on the wrong horse when they bet on a light airplane and a 30 caliber gun.
During the raid, 4 Zeros fell, but the Americans lost 2 planes and their pilots, while 2 others were wounded. The usual bombing raid followed shortly, but because the Japanese were unsure of the situation on the ground, they bypassed Henderson and droned on toward Taivu Point, thought to be in American hands since the Tassenboko raid. They dumped their bombs on their helpless countrymen who had reoccupied the area. At Rabaul, Japanese commanders were puzzled. They were certain that Kawaguchi had been successful in his bid to retake the airfield, but the bullet holes in planes returning from Guadalcanal suggested otherwise. Kawaguchi had been thwarted in his initial attempt when neither Colonel Oka in the west nor the Kuma Battalion in the east attacked as scheduled. As night began to fall, General Kawaguchi was certain a better coordinated effort would overwhelm the Americans. Edson's men had prepared a defensive line 1,800 yards long. Deployed in combat groups of approximately platoon strength, they were organized at about 100-yard intervals. At 18:30, the first blows fell on the ridge as 2,000 Japanese sprinted toward the Marines in waves. They bent back the lines, but they could not break them. Even as the raiders were resisting the charge, shells began to drop on Henderson. To the east, the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, faced the Kuma Battalion.
We were spread out awful thin. It was just almost a one-man line. We did have double apron wire out, and as good a defense as you could put together. But there was this field of high grass in front of us, and they had come through the grass. Again, they hit in the middle of the night. Why they picked the night to do all these things, I'm not sure. But they hit in the middle of the night, and everybody from Headquarters Company spent the rest of the night hauling ammunition up to the line because they were just using it like it was going out of style.
U.S. artillerymen rained shells down on the Kuma Battalion as they struggled through the barbed wire. Those who got through were met by machine gun fire. Back on the ridge, only about 300 Marines remained. Edson pulled them back to the spine of the ridge, only 1,500 yards from Henderson. But there they stayed while the Japanese suffered an onslaught of steel. Colonel Edson called in artillery fire, bringing it ever closer to his own lines. 105mm shells rained down on the Japanese. Throughout the long dawn of September 14th, the Battle of Edson's Ridge, known thereafter as Bloody Ridge, flickered and flared. At daybreak, P-400 spewed cannon fire into Kawaguchi's assembly points, while tanks drove back the remainder of the Kuma Battalion.
They went up and down through the grass to flush them out, and there's bodies laying out in the wire, and there was a Jap officer that somehow or other had gotten over or through the wire, and we're standing there, and every once in a while a Jap machine gun would open up, and you'd just watch where the tracers were going, and when they started coming down towards you, you'd duck. But we're standing there, and that dead Jap officer rolled over and tossed a grenade, and so we ducked. And he was dead after that.
The third prong of Kawaguchi's master plan, Colonel Oka's force, finally attacked the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines at daybreak. The attack was driven off with the help of an artillery barrage, as were several feeble attempts later that day. The men that remained from all 3 Japanese units were forced to withdraw into the jungle.
I think it was the morning after the battle we had on the Bloody Ridge episode thing. The cooks showed up with our usual ration of oatmeal, and you had to pick the worms and the weevils and the bugs out of it. Some of them walked out, but some of them you had to pick out with a fork, and powdered milk, and they brought that up for our breakfast, and the colonel just hit the ceiling. And he got on those cooks, and it's not really repeatable what he called them, but he said, "You get back there and you be back here in 30 minutes with pancakes for these men." And by God, they were. Of course, they had weevils in them too, but at least they were cooked weevils.
The Marines achieved a significant victory in the Battle of Bloody Ridge. Had the Japanese succeeded in retaking Henderson Field, the Marines would have had a difficult time holding the island. The raiders and paratroops suffered 263 casualties, with 59 killed or missing. Recorded losses in other units added another 38 killed and 18 wounded. Japanese losses were estimated at more than 700 killed and 500 wounded. While the struggle for Bloody Ridge was ebbing, Admiral Turner steamed toward Guadalcanal with transports bearing the 7th Marines. The convoy and its covering force, which included the carrier Wasp, set a course well east of the normal approach, hoping to avoid Japanese air searches. At 1100 on September 15th, a Japanese reconnaissance plane lumbered overhead, and Turner knew he'd been spotted. Racked by indecision, Turner maintained course until 1500, when he resolved to withdraw. But before he could issue his order, the American Navy suffered another disaster. Japanese submarines had been deployed in the path of the American convoy, and at 1445, I-19 fired 6 torpedoes at Wasp.
Wasp had just recovered a flight of SBDs when a Japanese submarine launched what may arguably be described as the single most effective torpedo attack ever conducted in naval history. With one spread of torpedoes, the submarine sank the aircraft carrier Wasp, blew the stern off a destroyer, and also damaged a battleship and got away clean. I don't think that's ever been done before or since.
2 torpedoes struck Wasp with catastrophic effect as gasoline storage tanks and the forward bomb magazine took direct hits. Electrical lines and fire mains were severed, and Wasp took an immediate 10 to 15 degree list. While flooding presented no immediate danger, there was no means to effectively fight the fire, and Wasp was ordered abandoned at 1520.
The Japanese philosophy for the use of submarines is to use them as scouts for the fleet and also to attack large enemy warships. And this is in direct contrast to the American view, which is to use submarines to penetrate deep into enemy territory, attack the merchant shipping, and cut the logistical and supply lines in that way. The Japanese will fail to understand this aspect of the war and fail to change their tactics as the war progresses. And that problem will cost the Japanese dearly throughout this war.
The loss of the carrier and 173 men was a terrible blow to the Navy, yet it did not adversely affect the situation on Guadalcanal.
The main advantage to the defenders on Guadalcanal was that they inherited a couple of the Wasp's squadrons, which flew ashore and reinforced the Cactus Air Force. And some of those folks under Lieutenant Commander John Eldridge, who was an extremely fine dive bomber pilot and a leader who was later lost in action, reinforced the Air Force ashore at Guadalcanal at a time when it was badly needed. So loss of the Wasp at that point was perhaps not as critical a blow as it might have been somewhat earlier.